Welcome back to the Replatform podcast. It is myself, James Gerd, and I'm joined again by my co-host, Paul Rogers. How you doing, mate?
I'm good, thanks. Although I'm now very conscious that my jumper matches the background on the video version of this podcast.
Camouflage.
Yeah.
It's like Sly Stallone in Rambo, mate. You're a legend.
Yeah, not ideal. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. I'm celebrating the fact that there has been cricket on today whilst working from home with a nice cheeky beer. So I'm going professional for tonight's podcast. So we're doing another Talking Heads episode. This is where myself and Paul kind of bat around some questions, share our perspectives and experience from previous projects, and hopefully it's of interest to you. And the topic tonight is, does the e-commerce platform choice really matter? So let's talk about why we're discussing this. So it's fair to say the platform vendor landscape is pretty cluttered, wouldn't you say, mate?
Yeah, absolutely. Increasingly so.
Yes, indeed. People have their preferences, that might be based on prior experience and previous jobs. And also, let's be honest, bias. We're all human. We do have biases. For example, I've worked with e-commerce directors who absolutely love Magento, but I've also worked with an equal number who really don't like it and won't go near it. So sometimes there is rational decisions behind it, and sometimes it's quite an emotional, personal thing rather than any practical reality. So depending on which export source you read, the recommendation for which platform is best will vary. There are so many resources as well. You've got, Gartner's Magic Quadrant, Forrester's Wave, but they don't feature the full market. And there are so many platforms that are like niche players out there that aren't really on the kind of mainstream radar. And we've covered some of these in our podcast. We've covered platforms like Centra, for example, or Ecommerce from a B2B point of view. And when comparing platforms, it often looks at face value like they do very similar things. It's a big tick box exercise. Yes, we can do all these features. It's very hard sometimes to tell the difference between them, which can lead you to say, well, is there any real benefit between or difference between them, or does it really matter? And that's why we're asking this question. Does it really matter? We obviously have our own strong opinions, but we wanted to kind of try and work this through and give some evidence for why we think it does matter, and give some examples of when maybe there's an easier option than doing a very laborious and complex platform selection project. Because let's face it, it costs money to do it. It takes time, and it obviously takes you out of your day-to-day work. So that's the context. Anything else you wanted to add, Paul?
No, I don't think so. I think that's covered it really. On to the next question.
Right, let's get cracking on our devil's advocate rounds. So the first one is what are the key challenges with doing detailed platform evaluations and selection processes? Let's start with why might some people not want to do it, basically.
Yeah, so from my perspective, I think the main reason, you just outlined it there, I think time is probably the biggest one. A lot of the time, these projects have pretty tight deadlines, like tight timescales, and people want to make a decision quickly. Alternatively, there's other people that have got strong opinions within the business, like you say, kind of biased. But I do think it's become very important. And I think obviously, you in particular are an independent consultant, and I am to a certain extent. But I do think nowadays this has become very complex, and it's really important to bring in kind of external advice, I guess, just because it's not just a case of choosing a platform anymore, particularly with kind of how the headless side of things has grown, and all of these new kind of best of breed platforms. It's not really a like for like anymore. Like a few years ago, and we were talking about this earlier, but a few years ago, you had Magento, you had Salesforce, you had Shopify. If you're like a B2C brand, now you've probably got 15 different vendors in that space. And, some of them are monolithic, some of them are headless only, some of us are headless first, some of them have got, kind of different modules available. Like it's you can't really compare apples for apples. And I think that's why it's become such an important thing. And it's obviously one of the most important decisions an e-com business can make.
Yeah, agreed. I think this is the challenge. There are so many different labels out as well. Headless is the buzzword and the obsession at the moment, but headless means different things to different platforms depending on how truly natively headless is versus a platform that's been retrofitted to be headless, but it might not have a completely full and open API set. You've got unified commerce. Platforms like Proximus use this. Spryker talk about unified commerce. So many different platform versions. I think this is the challenge. The challenge is to know what platforms you look at and why. When you've got, even if you're a big enterprise, you take Gartner's Quadrant and there's probably 10 or 12 platforms in there. Well, which ones do you go for? Do you go for the market leaders? Do you go for the niche players? Do you go for the visionaries? And what does that really mean? And then it's also about how do you get meaningful information, because it's quite hard if you're new to this to unpick the sales speak and get to the heart of the matter and talk about not can you do feature X, like, can you do omnichannel? Yes, we can, great. But not can you, how does it work? What's native? What's customizable? How does it align with how we want to do it? I think that these are the challenges why sometimes people just go, whoa, this is too much. We know other people who use Shopify will use that, or BigCommerce, whatever it might be, and that's the path of least resistance. Also, testimonials give distorted views, because a testimonial only exists because the client's happy or whisper it, incentivized to do this. So a testimonial is, you get given it, it's not going to say we didn't like it or this wasn't good. It's going to tell you the rosy side of it. So I think a lot of that makes people a little bit reluctant if they're not experienced and have that practical view of we could make this work and do this in a simple way to make a better decision.
I think that due diligence piece now is critical, and I think there's just so many variables. Because even like you say around the headless piece, we haven't talked about proprietary platform, proprietary technology within different agencies. Yeah, I think, and also like the ecosystems around these platforms. I think you need to bring in specialists nowadays. It's just become such a big, broad kind of decision.
Yeah, and it's also sometimes it's not which e-commerce platform, it's which platforms driving the business need. And sometimes people go for like a real enterprise CMS or CMS/CRM, whatever it might be first, and go, right, we've picked that. We now need to find the best e-commerce platform that integrates with this to give us our commerce functionality. So yes, it's like peeling an onion. Where do you start? So with that in mind, that there are challenges, and therefore the level of expertise and resources in a business will impact the willingness or desire to do this. Let's talk about why do some businesses pick a platform without doing a selection? Because it does happen. There sometimes are valid use cases, but that then creates risks, and we will talk about those afterwards. So I'm going to throw a few out and then over to you, mate, to kind of like talk through from your experience. So for me, there's obvious one, end of life. You had, for example, Magento 1 to Magento 2, people who are bedded into the Magento ecosystem and have already committed to that platform, and they go through the re-platforming to version 2 because they've decided Magento ecosystem is right for them. That rarely happens, but it is a use case. Another one I've found, prior experience. So a new person comes in and they have used a platform in a previous business that has a similar operating model, similar business structure, and therefore they decide that that's the right one to bring in because they already did their due diligence in a previous life. And then another one I think is interesting is investors. So I've worked for a big UK retailer with global reach, where there was a change of perspective in a replatforming project where initially we were looking at doing internal build and building out that engineering capability. But then a change of ownership and investment appointed a global SI who were the technology partner for that business's entire portfolio, and they built on a specific platform. So the decision was made for us, basically. So those are the ones I've seen where actually platform selection just doesn't happen. It's a pre-baked decision.
Yeah, so I think so your point around investors, I think is quite interesting, particularly like at the moment, like so much of the market or things that are happening in e-com is coming from investors, just because everyone's putting money or like desperate to put money into e-com brands, technology providers, everything else. So I do think that's a really good one. I think another one would be, so you've mentioned that you've added a note here around integration for specific ERPs. Like not as much anymore, but for a while, I think ERP actually had quite a big influence. So we've had clients that have gone with Hybris as a result of using SAP. NetSuite and Suite Commerce was quite a big thing for a while, particularly in the US. And that was quite a big one. And then I guess the only other one, you mentioned the SI. And I think the other thing that I've seen a lot of recently is where someone's working with an SI, they're pretty happy. SI now supports multiple platforms, and maybe I think there's been a lot of movement from brands that had a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to M1 end of life and went maybe Salesforce, because that was the obvious one to them at the time, maybe M2, and then they've now done their 3 years and they had a 3-year contract. So they've then evaluated again, and actually that SI has then enforced that decision, or like kind of pushed a specific platform, be it like, they now support Ecommerce or Shopify. Yeah. That's actually a big one, I think, at the moment. But
definitely, because I mean, somebody we both know very well, because you used to be business partner with Mark at GPMD. I brought him in on a project where, well, actually there was the best approach, because of the nature of the project, was actually to work with somebody who could listen to their high level requirements, help guide them, and recommend the platform they think technically and business wise would best fit out of a subset of platforms, because the ones he works with were well aligned with that business, and that simplified the process massively for them.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think there's a lot of people that made a decision as a result of M1 end of life that have either stayed with that agency or since moved, that have then started another re-platform within the first 3 years, and that's been driven by the agency they're working with now, be it the one that did the initial build or someone that's taken over since. But I think like you say, your first point around M2, that was probably the biggest thing to ever happen to the platform market, because at that point there were hundreds of thousands of M1 stores, and maybe 20,000 pretty significant stores on Magento, 20,000 plus, and suddenly all of those are doing reviews, or at least a pretty high proportion. So that's probably the biggest one that made people just upgrade or migrate to M2.
Yeah, I have to say, I mean, bear in mind that I made the comment earlier about there are those situations where Magento 1 to 2 and people are committed to it. My advice is always to people, when it's not just a like transfer migration, it's a proper re-platform, because M1 to M2 wasn't just a let's shift our data, and it was architecturally completely different. So you had to go through a full migration process. I've always advised people to do their due diligence and make the decision, because if you made the decision 2 years ago that Magento was right, and you've got a new architecture and a new strategy and vision, you've still got to make sure that's right, even if it's a light touch due diligence where you just assess that your rationale for using it are right. You should do that. And I definitely found a few people who stayed with Magento having done that, but others who moved because they suddenly realized that, for example, the cost of ownership wasn't going to be as preferable anymore. Right, so that's let's move on to this. This to me is a key question. What are the risks of not doing a proper evaluation? Let me explain what I mean by proper evaluation to the listeners. I'm not talking about we spent 6 months on a mountaintop agonizing at every last detail of our 286 functional requirements. I mean, doing your due diligence to know what drives your platform decision, what the impact of a platform will be, what the cost implications, etc. So what do you think are the risks? And that can be light touch, heavy touch, depending on the size of the project. Paul, from your point of view, what are the biggest risks of not doing an evaluation and just going, I'll take that one?
Well, I think the obvious one is just making the wrong decision. I think we've both probably spoken to a number of brands, even recently, that have made that wrong decision, and a year in, I think, are re-platforming. And I would say, I mean, that's the big risk, isn't it, really? Like, I think some of the worst ones I've probably seen has been with businesses that have maybe a lot of it's been the proprietary platforms, to be honest, where people have, been sold the dream. They've literally just seen this solution that might be like a slightly easier migration process, a bit more like white glove support. They've been sold a bit of an all-in-one offering, or a very professional services heavy approach. And they regret it as soon as they start to try and, really push the roadmap or do things in a certain way, etc. And I guess that's where, you need to really do your due diligence. You need to really understand the pros and cons of all the different models. And I think, the M1 to M2 is another great example where a lot of people didn't do an evaluation, and they actually didn't consider some of the SaaS platforms that are maybe a little bit more aligned with their team and their business goals and everything else. And then again, they regretted it. And I guess the real risk there is that you end up doing another CapEx project, which takes a significant amount of resource, time, budget that should be going into other projects. It should be driving your business forward.
Yeah, you made an interesting point actually earlier about I think about having to redo it or having to realise and accept you've got the decision wrong, and there's a big impact on that in terms of the lack of trust that then builds in a business in your decision making capabilities. And one of the things that I've always found really important in any platform selection project, whether it is we've spent 2 to 3 days just workshopping it or we've spent 4 to 6 weeks doing it in detail, is having a structured process and a set of criteria that are agreed, that define how you select, that everyone buys into, so that everyone who's a senior stakeholder, whether it's finance, e-commerce director, the finite sponsor of the project, the day-to-day owner of it, they have all agreed and bought into it and understood the limitations and the impact and the risks at a high level, so that if down the line in 3 to 6 months it all goes Pete Tong, that nobody can just gang up on the e-commerce lead and say, you put this into the business, because everyone bought into it. And therefore you have a kind of group ownership of the issue, because it becomes really political if somebody has pushed something and the others turn around and go, wow, but hang on a minute, you told us this was right.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the most important things for that, maybe like project lead internally or like project owner internally as well, because I've seen it the other way where they haven't done that. Someone's been given full responsibility and overall control over the decision, and even if it's the right one, people still aren't happy. Most replatforming projects, you're going to have snags after launch, you're going to have some level of short-term impact, and then that kind of like blame piece is hard to avoid unless, like you say, you've got everyone fully bought in.
Yeah, exactly. And then it's ever decreasing circles of arguments, and then basically here's the barriers between the different departments, which makes working together much harder. The other thing I think that doesn't get talked about enough is total cost of ownership. And if you don't do an evaluation, you won't get into the detail about the different cost streams that can come out. And it's amazing how many people have their pants pulled down 6 to 12 months down the road, where it's, oh, we didn't realise that there was this cost, or we didn't realise that this cost was going to scale and increase at this rate based on our growth curve. And if you just sit there and go, okay, we're going to pick this platform based on license fee, you're missing a massive trick.
I completely agree with that. And I think some of the clients that we've worked with recently, I've been shocked at like the disproportionate like OPEX costs against how much they're actually turning over, how much they're aiming to turn over, like the size of the business. And I think, yeah, I completely agree with that. I think unless you do the proper analysis and really understand the true cost of ownership of all of the different options available, and kind of understand where you're paying more and, have a reason for it. I think, I've spoke to some businesses recently that, are spending 5 to 10 times as much as they probably should be spending on a kind of annual OPEX basis.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And I think another one as well for me that I found in a few cases where businesses have basically implemented a platform and built, and just processes have grown, not because they're the right process, but because that's how the business has worked to get things done. And those processes aren't that efficient. They take more time than they should. There's lots of workarounds. There's additional code to make things work. And then if you just try and carry on as you've got and just put it into a new platform, you might not work with somebody who can actually help you improve that and give you a better default out-the-box process. And you see this sometimes in things like order management, data flows within a business, and a couple of projects I worked on where either the vendor solution specialist or the SI that's kind of pitching that vendor is able to turn around and give really good insights about how we can actually strip out inefficiency, improve processes. So sometimes you get these additional benefits by going through a process that you weren't initially expecting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anything else that you've seen in terms of risk when people haven't done an evaluation?
I think that's the main thing, isn't it? It's really like understanding what the opportunities are and what it's almost like a SWOT analysis, isn't it? Really, like, you might not position it like that, but really understanding, what you could how you could benefit over a period of time from replatforming, or some of the other platforms where you might lose out. And I think that point you just made around process is really important, because it might be there's a really good opportunity to simplify. It might be there's a really good opportunity to make something scale. I think it's just the opportunity of reviewing what you're doing, how you're doing it, and where you're allocating your time and budget.
Yeah, time to pause, breathe, and think. And actually, that one other point I've forgotten about is it's also about getting the buy-in of key stakeholders. And a good example is customer service. And I've seen this in a project where a platform was selected, it was implemented. The customer service team weren't closely involved. It was literally hey guys, we're putting a new platform in. But actually, some of the back-end processes in the admin systems for how customer services would access and retrieve customer level information, the depth of information they could get, how they could use that information to append it with notes, or quickly search for it, how they would handle phone orders, was not as intuitive as the system they've been used to. So from the start, those people weren't bought into the platform, and they were very negative about it, and also get their backs up, and understandably, because they're key stakeholders in this project. So sometimes if you don't do a proper evaluation, you can think the feature might work and it might look good for you, but you're not the end user, and therefore in practical terms, when it's being used in anger, it's not as efficient, and that can cost you money, because if suddenly the time to do a real simple task is doubled, that's inefficiency and time lost.
Yeah, absolutely.
So with that in mind, we talked about some of the risks. What are the use cases then when platform decision materially impacts a business? So those are some of the functional areas where actually in projects, getting the platform right has a massive impact on the business. You were talking earlier about team capabilities, basically.
Yeah, and I feel like for me, I think over the last few years, at least I've come to think that team is one of the biggest factors in all of this. I feel like team and cost are, just both massive. Like a lot of the time, so I was talking earlier about a project where someone I was speaking to who have a relatively small team have gone with one of the kind of best of breed API first platforms, not really understanding quite how big an impact that would have on their time to market for new features, the amount of time that needs to go into managing a development team, the amount of resources required to deliver that project, and how much they actually don't know going into it. And they've been sold the dream as this kind of like, and it is the right way to go for a lot of businesses where they've got, big teams, technical teams, CTO, et cetera. But for this business, it was a disaster. They lost over £1 million.
Wow.
And they'll probably end up replatforming again in a year. And there's a lot of friction. There's a lot of lost opportunity to the business going through what will probably be a 2-year technology project unnecessarily. And I think equally, there's an opportunity often to really kind of like simplify your business, and that's not always the goal. It's not always the need, but I do think that's often a real benefit of replatforming is the opportunity to take, you've got a small team, you've got a small product catalog, you're a brand. Realistically, what you care about is being able to bring the right people to the site, being able to create the right customer experience, brand experience, and not, and you want to reduce that kind of technical piece as much as possible. And you want everything to be simplified as much as possible. You want to have as much control over the front end as possible. And I think aligning the platform and the tech stack of your team is really important, because that can actually have a pretty significant impact on your roadmap as a business and the amount of time you're able to put into the things that will like move the needle or help your business grow. And I think the functional sides as well equally really like looking at what you need to grow the business over the next 3 to 5 years. Often there'll be a lot, particularly with things like COVID, people have ended up kind of going into different markets or introducing different models, all that kind of stuff. But for a lot of businesses, the things that you're going to look at over the next 3 years, just kind of making sure that the platform allows for that. So you've mentioned international, that's a big one for a lot of platforms. Because you've done a lot of international projects, you've got a lot of experience here.
What are some of the things that trip people up if they get the wrong platform selection? Like, how does it impact the business?
I think realistically, the biggest one, based on the platforms that people are likely to go with now, is the multi-store piece. And knowing, you might launch with a single store, but if you want to grow as a global business, in order to effectively localize, in order to avoid the FX charges, which we've obviously spoke about in the past, where you can only have, where you're limited around kind of how you're working with the payment provider on a single store. The whole multi-currency piece, every aspect of internationalization, you might end up with 10 stores. Suddenly that's a very different proposition. You still might be limited in certain areas. You might be required to bring in a PIM. You might be required to bring in other third parties. And suddenly, not really like thinking about that just means that you can't really understand the total cost of ownership.
Yes.
And even, I guess the obvious one would probably be Shopify. And as much as I'm still quite an advocate of using Shopify for international sites, if you're really going to, be a global brand and you've got a small team, that is going to take up a significant amount of time, just kind of building that out over time. And I guess that's the main one for me around international, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Knowing whether the standard setup of the platform enables you to achieve your international vision natively, or whether you need to consider going down the route of something like headless with a custom front end and with PIMs to achieve that. And the impact on your cost model is massive. And that point about FX rates is really important, because the how different platforms enable you to settle into different currencies. Like, do you have to settle into one standard bank account across different currencies and incur FX? Can you settle into the right currency depending on the currency the person's bought in? All of these things, suddenly you add these incremental percentage costs to the business, which, if you're scaling from a 1 million to a 100+ million business over the next 5 years, that's a big chunk of cash that could be spent on development, on headcount, whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, a lot of these, some of the platforms on the market that aren't as strong around international, a lot of things can suddenly dictate that store architecture. It could be, opening different warehouses, different kind of requirements around front end localization. And that is something that definitely needs to be thought about.
Yes. Another one for me is complex product data. So if you have lots of different types of products, and some of those products have complex data models, a good example is jewelry. So having worked with a luxury jewelry brand where you have the elements like the diamond, and the diamond has different properties, the 4 C's of diamonds. You have different shanks, and there are rules that define what size of shank suits has to go with each diamond, each ring type, and there are different costs associated with it. But the ability to create that data model that automates that process, so that you lose the complexity of having to manually set up every single individual association. That doesn't work easily on all platforms. Some platforms, Magento, this is one of the areas where Magento is very, very good at enabling you to handle complex product data models. So that can impact it. It doesn't mean you have to change the platform you ideally want just on that point, but it means you have to think about how that platform will align with your business needs.
And often what other, so that PIM, going back to that PIM point, I think, I've seen people scale very complex product catalogs with Shopify, but they have ended up using a PIM just to change the way that product data is managed and avoid risk of quality, I guess, or avoid just allowing people to input certain fields in different ways. And Shopify is getting much better at this now, or gradually getting better at this. But I think, if you were to a business like the one you're talking about, if you had that on Shopify, realistically, I think you could probably do it. But you would probably want something like a PIM in place just to make things easier for your product management team.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. How about B2B? What's your take on this? Because B2B is obviously this scale of some B2B businesses are basically B2C features and functionality. Others are more complex with, customer segments, complex pricing rules, quotations, multi-tiered account management. So to what degree do you think B2B influences?
I think that's one of the biggest variables at the moment that's impacting us, because our average client is probably quite different to yours, where it's mostly relatively simple premium fashion brand or like somewhere thereabouts. But I think a lot of our clients end up going with Shopify, as you know. But one of the biggest things is, people wanting to do wholesale through the platform or already doing wholesale through the platform, and the level of wholesale or B2B and how that scales. And I think the scale piece is the interesting one, because a lot of platforms have basic B2B functionality. But, if you need the data to come out in a certain way, or, you need to scale that up and it becomes more complex and you have more advanced, like credit rules or roles or, CPQ requirements, all of that kind of stuff. Sometimes it can't be done with a platform. But I think that's, it's probably the biggest blocker for Shopify. It's probably the biggest blocker for a few of the kind of newer platforms as well. But that's one where that can almost dictate, or at least rule out certain platforms.
Yeah, and also this then leads on to being sure that you've understood the roadmap and the focus of the platform, because each platform has a different focus area.
Yeah.
And they'll all be stronger in some areas than others. And the next 12 months will show you where they're going. And if, for example, B2B is a critical capability and you've got beyond the basic e-commerce functionality needs, having multi-tiered accounts where you have different permission levels for different users of what they can do, quote capabilities where customers can create quotes, sales agents can. Those quotes can be automatically generated into carts. Those carts can have the account level pricing applied, etc. That's really important to know, because if the roadmap is saying this feature set is not being developed, it might be all right now, but it might not be where you need to be in 12 months. So you've got to take that future vision into account.
I think the other thing with this as well, and this is so going back to something that you always say, and I think this is an area where you're really strong. No platform's perfect. You need to almost like prioritize some of this stuff. Like, you're always going to compromise on a platform, and it's like you almost need to map out from a business perspective. Like, I've seen people actually take B2B out of their platform, go with Shopify, and then pull in like New Order or something like that to rebuild how they're doing B2B, or they've simplified it. And I think, that's the big thing, isn't it? It's figuring out where you can and can't compromise and what's actually really important to the business.
Yeah, and understand how that ecosystem achieves it, because B2B is not the core focus of Shopify, but you have Bluebolt that used to be a proprietary platform that's now a Shopify partner, but they have turned their B2B capability into an app for Shopify. So that might suit certain businesses, and therefore you can remain in that ecosystem and achieve what you need. But yeah, exactly. B2B is definitely a key area that needs investigation. Another one, definitely down your street in terms of experience, omnichannel. So what talk us through some of the use cases where omnichannel will have an impact on the decision.
Yeah, so I guess it depends on what you're doing. If you need like livestock lookups, if you've got really complex kind of order management, or like a complex kind of checkout journey, complex order management requirements in terms of split orders, kind of doing like live availability lookups for collect in store, reserve in store, all of that kind of stuff. That actually, again, certain platforms, I've seen scenarios where people have wanted to move to a platform, but actually, there's certain teams within the business that are, or they're already fairly reliant on that kind of multi-channel piece and pushing people in store, and they know that there's business value behind it. And, as a business, they want people to go into the stores. And actually that stopped people from going to certain platforms. And I've seen that 2 or 3 times where I guess that's where people start to look at some of the more open platforms. It's often, I would say, like usually, because a lot of platforms claim to have a lot of this stuff built in, and I think that's great. But usually for me, it's been more the open platforms that allow them to have complete control over how that kind of experience works, and which stores they push, or where they push that click and collect option, etc. And even that kind of like view of inventory across the 2 channels. But yeah, I think that's a massive one. I think there's the lower level of omni-channel. Some platforms are much better at, and they've got built-in capabilities, and that can be really valuable. But like the more complex side can, definitely have a big influence on which platform you choose.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess my next one that I'm going to throw into the mix, we're not, there are endless numbers of functional areas we could talk about. We're just focusing on some of the key ones on this podcast. But if anyone's got any areas they want to discuss further, please do get in contact with us after this. But marketplace, for me, having recently done a market level assessment for a fashion brand that you know very well, you suddenly realise that depending on how simple or how complex you want the marketplace to be and how integrated you want it, so that you're not having to have lots of manual processes for things like order management, handling returns, etc., handling sales commissions, because obviously you can have proof of concept, integrate very simply, and you can extend the platform to add extra product types in. But if you want full end-to-end automation of where a payment gateway is taking the commissions and managing that, where the orders are syncing into all the different third parties for fulfillment, and any returns are coming in and updating and automating refunds, all that piece suddenly shifts the perspective of which platform over the long term will be the most cost effective when you factor in all the resources that are needed to maintain it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I obviously saw some of the work you did on that, and I think it's a huge market at the moment, and I actually think it's actually really complicated. I feel like a lot of people end up just looking at Miracle, but even combining Miracle with a platform, it needs a lot of due diligence. And again, you have a completely different way of thinking about TCO. I think that's a really big area of ecom at the moment is actually really complicated.
Yes, it is, and there's loads of platforms out there doing it. There's relatively new startups that offer, I guess, solid solutions, but not the in-depth feature and functionality list and level of like reporting, etc., that the likes of Miracles and Sprikers do. YoCart is quite a popular platform. You've got specialist platforms for marketplaces like Cocorico for rental space. I guess likes of B&Bs where the commerce transaction is renting properties, for example. It's an area where you need to make the decision carefully, because otherwise you could end up having to extensively customize and build on top of the existing platform, and all you're doing is you're shifting the cost, and you might create more complexity of maintenance. Okay, so those are some of the use cases, and as I said, we can't possibly explain them all on a short podcast. But with everything we discussed in mind, what's your take on the final question? Should you always do a selection project?
I think we both agree on this, which I think you should. And I think the other thing is, we're talking about this, I think with a lot of the bigger platforms and the enterprise platforms, even when you're doing an upgrade project, I've seen brands or businesses spend £1 million on an upgrade, and that's, a good opportunity for them to review their infrastructure or their tech stack. But I think so nowadays, especially, it's become so complex. There's so many, threats and weaknesses and opportunities around this and around technology in ecom. I think you have to run these processes personally.
Yeah, I agree. The aim of this was a devil's advocate question, but I'm very strongly in agreement that you should always do a selection process. However, the length and complexity and depth of information you get into will need to be aligned with the size of your business, the impact that e-commerce has, and your growth plans. If you're never going to be a massive business, and it's only going to be maybe a few 100,000 or a few million versus tens, hundreds of millions, then you can do a lighter touch on it. If you're a pure play brand and you're not a massive omni-channel business, or you're only single country, not international, then the complexity reduces on that level as well. So I also think one of the key things in this is it's not about looking at 30 platforms. It's about starting off with that question of what are our business and technology principles? What is it that we want to own versus outsource, and why? And what type of platform do we want to work with? Some businesses I work with, they love the idea of being able to control the front, as you do, a business you work with as well, Paul. They want to control the front end in-house. They want internal front end development team so they can rapidly iterate, and that suits some fast growth brands really well. Other businesses I work with, they don't have the resource, they'll never have the headcount, they will never achieve that level of internal control. What they want is a platform with a good admin system that they can just trade and focus on merchandising and trading and growth. And they don't want to worry about support and maintenance and hosting and any of that. So a SaaS platform like a Shopify or a Ecommerce will work really well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the ones we haven't, just where that's a couple of things you've mentioned there that reminded me, and we haven't touched on this yet, and I don't want to open it up too much, but is subscriptions as well. And that's another one that's really interesting. Because I think that has a big impact. Suddenly some businesses that I've worked with have started doing subscriptions, and now they're actually mostly focused on subscription. And that's an area where you can do it with most platforms, but it doesn't always scale. And that's a whole nother piece. But I think going back to the original question, I think, all of this stuff just requires due diligence, doesn't it? And, even like the BA process of really forcing them, going through what do we actually want to do, usually it warrants it in itself.
Yeah, I completely agree. So let's do a wrap up of key takeaway points. And my key takeaway point is, if you don't do this and you don't do the assessment and due diligence, as Paul said, and you don't look at the cost model piece, you can end up making a false steer and end up with money down the line that you weren't expecting. A good example, I worked on a project for a premium fashion brand, and we ended up doing a shortlist comparison of Magento Enterprise versus Salesforce Commerce Cloud. And halfway through the project, we got challenged by the VCs to say, why are you looking at Salesforce? It's too expensive. We shouldn't be going down that route. And I had to sit down and explain to their finance team about like-for-like comparisons of cost models, and that Magento at face value isn't comparable because of the additional functionality that Salesforce had that was important and aligned with the key functional requirements of the business, like AI, ML, search, merch, personalization. And when you then factor in those additional systems you'd need to plug into Magento, to achieve the comparable functionality, those costs scale as a business grows, and the business was on a growth plan from 10 million up to 150 million plus. So you suddenly see by year 3 that those costs are huge, and they actually dwarf the additional license fee of Salesforce. So that's why it's important to do this, because it means that you're not making false assumptions and you're challenging any biases you might have.
Yeah, and I think my one is probably just, and this is quite generic and high level, but it's just think about what you actually want over like a period of time, and kind of bringing everything together and really understanding your goals. Like, if you're not looking to grow significantly or become more complex, you might have a good opportunity to simplify. Equally, if you're trying to simplify, but you do have something in 2 years' time that might completely blow things up, like just make sure you fully understand the kind of, I guess, where you're going and align that with the platform. Yeah,
those are our takeaway points. We hope this has been useful. It was very much a talking heads open discussion, throwing around some ideas. It's not an exhaustive discussion. We'd love to carry on the conversation if anyone listening wants to have a chat, or even if you want to challenge us on some of the stuff we said. So thanks as always for listening and watching. Keep an ear open for the next episodes, and do let us know if there's any topics or discussions you'd like to see us cover. Always looking for inspiration. If you haven't already subscribed, please do so. And also, anyone who hasn't rated us so far on like Apple or Spotify, much appreciated if you could. It really helps kind of nudge our visibility in those stores. Wonderful. Take care. For more information on this topic, head over to replatform.fm for our audio podcasts. To discuss a project, or if you'd like to chat about any of the topics covered in this episode in more detail, please reach out to myself, James Gurd, or my co-host Paul Rogers via LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks again for listening, and keep your ears peeled for the next episode.